Hello, everyone. It's November 28th, 2023. This is the end of November frontline update specifically for the Avdiivka area. There's been a lot going on in the last couple weeks. I apologize. I've actually been traveling quite a bit. So, traveling, spending family time. I want to wish a late happy Thanksgiving to everybody in the states that celebrates that. So, I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in here. Just real quick note, I appreciate all of the positive feedback and everyone that's been watching the podcast. I had a couple podcast episodes drop while I was gone. So I think the podcast is going pretty well, actually. We had basically three different opinions on the state of the Ukraine war currently. One that was definitely leaning a little more pro-Western, from a former British fighter pilot, one neutral one from a friend of the channel, Alex from History Legends, and then one that's leaning a little more towards the pro-Russian side with Scott from Calibrated. If don't want to really label any of them, but all of them are normal people with good analytical skills, and each one of them said a lot of things that I agree with. And I think that's why I want to do these discussions in the first place, is because we all have a lot more in common than we think we do. So just keep that in mind. Everyone's got a bit of humanity, and I think you can see that in the podcast episodes we're doing so far. Hopefully, in the next couple weeks, I'm going to do the same thing for what's going on in Israel with several different opinions, and I'm going to have some more podcast guests mixed in here and there. Some pretty cool people with some pretty good analysis of geopolitics. So make sure you're watching out for the Geopop perspective. The podcast episodes are getting posted up on this channel. They're just in a podcast playlist folder. They should also appear in the regular folders as well, in the regular playlist folders, that is. So, what's going on in Avdiivka? Since we last spoke, quite a bit has happened. First, we're going to start with the northern area with territorial changes, then we're going to talk about the overall situation. To the very north of Krasnogorovka, the Russians have moved in the rest of the way on the railway. This is kind of what we suspected. Russian movement to the north here. It looks like the Russians are actually trying to push even further north into Karamik and I believe Novokalinove. So moving towards the north of Novokalinove, Karamik, not much more progress has been made since this. This happened about a week ago, give or take, but there are still pretty heavy battles in the area. There's actually quite a bit of snowfall on the ground. I don't know if anyone here has been seeing the combat footage coming out from the battlefield, but quite a bit of snow in some places. Some places it seems like it might be clearing up. It's hard to tell. It could just be week-old videos that have finally been edited by whatever propagandist that puts out all the combat footage. So combat was slowing down over the last week. A lot of these moves were made more or less a week ago. Some of them are a little more recent, but once the ground is frozen, we're probably not likely to see a slow in the fighting. It's going to be like the winter time that was talked about last year that never really happened. Once the ground is completely frozen over, if that actually does end up happening this year in Ukraine, it's going to be hard enough for movement of armored vehicles and stuff where the Ukrainians and the Russians won't have to worry about their tanks getting stuck in the mud. The next update here is Stepove. The Ukrainians actually launched a counterattack and re-entered the town. It's unknown if Russian troops actually controlled all of the town or not, if some of it might have been in the gray zone. Either way, the town is obviously completely destroyed. So it's kind of difficult to tell from some of the combat footage that's going out, but this is one of the latest updates that we consider to be a little bit more reliable. In terms of the coke plant, there's actually a lot going on here. The Russians have definitely extended their control further down the forest belt that separates the coke plant from the landfill, where they bring the discarded materials from the steelmaking process to. Definitely because of the height advantage here, Russia's going to be able to keep pushing forward. Now, some pro-Russian sources are actually saying, and by pro-Russian I mean Rybar, which is basically if I had to guess, was probably Russian intelligence that works on that. But they're claiming that a larger area, something more like this, encompassing some of these dachas here in this area, as well as the entirety of this chunk of land, has also fallen into Russian control. And if that's true, that means that the battles are approaching the doorstep of what's likely some administrative buildings here for the coke and steel factory. So it definitely seems like Russia, um, if they're going to be moving in a slow roll, they would like to slowly move into the coke plant. If the coke plant ends up falling to Russian forces, which there's actually, um, a pretty good chance that's where they're going to place their efforts, rather than the rest of Avdiivka, then I mean the entire city is completely screwed from a defensive standpoint. There's no way that Ukraine can hold on to Avdiivka if they lose the coke plant. So you can guarantee that Ukrainian forces are going to be fighting very hard to maintain control of this position. Ukrainian commanders are going to be using up a lot of resources here, to defend this area. So we'll keep an eye on this part of the battlefield. In terms of, I guess you would call this, we'll call this area like west or east of the coke plant. This first row of dachas has started to fall under Russian control. And actually moving in, looking at it from this angle, I think this is pretty good. There's still a lot of ground that needs to be covered by the Russians. This is probably why some of the Russian sources are claiming this area up here has been captured. If the Russians are moving on both sides of these lakes at the same time, it's probably going to be far more beneficial. If they're moving on this side, that potentially cuts off some of the reinforcement routes across the lakes. Of course, reinforcements can still move in from the south, but they're going to have to travel a lot further to get there. So probably we're going to continue to see Russia pushing in this direction if they're not already. Sometimes it takes a couple days to get reliable battlefield information. One of the biggest updates in the Avdiivka area is actually in the southern industrial zones. Quite a bit of territory has fallen under Russian control over the last week or so. First, initially, we had reports of this Donetsk filtration plant, which I guess we can actually try and get some of these back on here so we can see where the defenses are. This Donetsk filtration plant, initially, Suryak Maps was reporting had fallen into Russian hands. He's since reversed that. Whether or not it's the Ukrainians counterattacked and recaptured the position, or if Russia actually just never managed to grab onto it, I'm not exactly sure. But this does run roughly over top some of the initial Ukrainian defense lines that have been in place since 2014. So there's a lot of places down here where those 2014, those decade-long bunkers and trenches have been stormed and captured by the Russians, specifically down in this sector south of the filtration plant. If you zoom in here and let's go ahead and hide this real quick. You can see trench systems right here in the forest. This is actually a trench network going through here. There's several others. There's trenches, let me see, right through here that you can see right there on the other side of these tree lines. All of this is now is either fallen to Russian forces or is in the process of being captured. The Russian progress here is probably further than what we have mapped out, but it appears like the main cause of that is probably logistic troubles for Avdiivka. Without steady supplies slowing in, being choked on both sides by artillery and whatnot, losses on the battlefield, which, we try not to discuss because it's difficult to determine, exactly how many troops one side or the other has at any given moment. There's definitely been a lot of losses. But, whether it's a troop issue or a supply issue, Ukraine is withdrawing from this southern area in order to shorten their defensive line and relieve some pressure on themselves. So this entire industrial area here now under Russian control, along with the houses here. Once again, reverting to more of a 3D view, you can see this is kind of a big hill, and you have a bit of a valley streaking through here. Those of you that are having trouble seeing it, there's a valley and a kind of a steep hill growing up on both sides of it. You can actually see how that dips below the terrain there significantly. I would guess that Russia's probably captured basically all the positions on top of this hill. Ukraine has probably retreated to the other side to some of these fortified areas here, which, you know, as you can see, are clearly heavily entrenched. So, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean where the lines here, it doesn't necessarily mean Russia isn't controlling this area. It's difficult to move into kind of barren um, terrain, you know, where there's no trenches or anything actually dug here yet. So if Russians are popping their heads up through the forest, obviously Ukrainians can shoot at them. So Russia will probably move into these areas. I would imagine a lot of these movements we see that aren't into former trench networks of one side or the other, they probably take some time because one side has to build up to that location. Um, you know, you dig a trench, and then you dig a trench line straight forward towards the enemy until you advance so many yards, you know, 50 yards or 20, 50, 100 yards, whatever, and then you start digging out parallel to the enemy line. I'm trying to think of a pop culture example, maybe Last of the Mohicans, if you've ever seen that movie. Great movie, but there's a scene where the French are besieging a British fort, and you kind of see how they're digging their trenches and advancing. It's kind of cool. Anyways, a little bit of progress by Russian forces here towards this location, which, yeah, the Tarska. This is what we're calling the Tarska stronghold. Is this area right here? This was formerly a restaurant or a club or something like that to the south of Avdiivka. It's been heavily fortified, and it's used as a main operating base by Ukrainian troops in this southern direction. They distribute forces everywhere from this location. The Russians have been trying to push up on that, but as you can see, this is densely forested area, so this is you know, a difficult place to advance. I would say that the Russians, one of the only reasons why they're able to advance is likely due to the supply situation. You know, Ukrainians have to try and shorten the line, fall back to somewhere a little more defensible, probably right in the middle of this forested area here. I would assume that there's more rows of trenches. You can see some stuff definitely here from the satellite view. There's trench networks. Right here's trench networks. Of course, you know, very difficult to see a lot of this in old satellite image from space. Now over here to the area of Siversk, interesting developments here. The Russians are still trying to push up north here and capture Siversk. It seems like this is a more recent development that has happened after the snow was done falling inside Ukraine. So I don't really have any updates of things that have happened there quite yet. Hopefully in the next few days we get some information. I did end up rolling back this front line some. Initially we had marked that the Russians had captured this position right here in the creek bed because there was some video footage of Russian vehicles located right here in this exact spot. But that was probably a forward advance that was pushed back somewhat. So the Russians, we know, are about a field away from Siversk. So in the next couple weeks, we'll see if there's any development there. Now, another thing, so there's two things that have somewhat slowed the Russian advance, which is saying something because the Russians have captured just as much ground since the last update that I did than they had in the one before that. They're still capturing ground at the same pace. It seems like it probably would be moving faster if it not had been for there's apparently a horrific snowstorm that happened in Ukraine, a storm that came out from over the Black Sea. We'll talk about that a little bit in the next video. And so that was a big part of it. And the second part is Ukraine has begun to launch counterattacks in several other locations to relieve pressure off of Avdiivka. So in the north, there's a couple locations with counterattacks, and then there's a couple locations in other areas. I'm actually going to discuss that in a second video. This will be the first of two videos We're just going to do Avdiivka all by itself, give you guys that update. In the second video, we're going to talk about more or less battlefield updates, the overall situation in Ukraine at the end of the month of November. So thank you guys for joining, and I will see you next time.